All right, good morning. My talk today is on transmediality and adaptation in Tom Sawyer and Moby-Dick. This is part of a larger project exploring the relationship between 19th century American novels and their creative afterlives. This paper offers a comparative analysis of both the role of illustration and its incorporation into the respective story worlds of Herman Melville's Moby-Dick and Mark Twain's The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. What emerges as stories migrate across media and mutate through adaptation? Turning to the transmedial aspects of narrative representation, this paper builds from the argument that illustration does not merely supplement a novel's reading and interpretation, but actively reshapes them. Installing foregrounding and destabilizing particular readings that later adaptations inherit and extend. I trace how visual paratexts, specifically illustrations in Moby-Dick and Tom Sawyer, have conditioned the interpretive horizons through which these novels are transmitted and transformed. I will draw on and define key concepts such as transmediality, storyworlds, and remediation to help outline parallels between the critical reception of Moby-Dick and Tom Sawyer, how this reception relates to their lineage of illustrations, and how this lineage may have shaped a more limited reading of the adventures of Tom Sawyer that we tend to see reflected in its subsequent adaptations and discourse. In the preface to The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, Mark Twain calls attention to the reality that inspired his characters, while also, and most notably, framing the reality of its protagonist in terms of his multiplicity, an apparent contrast to Huck Finn's singularity. Huck Finn is, in quote, Huck Finn is drawn from life, Tom Sawyer also, but not from an individual. He is a combination of the characteristics of three boys whom I knew, and therefore belongs to the composite order of architecture. End quote. It is not enough that Twain's primary audience, children, though he hoped the book would not be shunned by men and women on that account, knew that there was a sense of reality to Tom Sawyer that they knew, but they knew that that sense of reality that created him, in all its specificity, was the result of an amalgamation, a construction and synthesis into a singular character. Twain's emphasis at the opening of the book that Tom belongs to the composite order of architecture situates this quality and idea as a key element of his novel, and invites us to think more critically about what that meant, not just for the words that brought him to life in the text, but also for the accompanying illustrations by T.W. Williams. Before delving too deeply into my reading and the necessary terminology of this paper, I want to first turn our attention to paintings to these two paintings, Henry Wallace's The Death of Chatterton and John Fuseli's The Nightmare, both of which circulated as popular prints in the 19th century. You might notice a few shared aesthetic features within these two images, but I'd like to call attention specifically to the pose of the central figures, the drama and placement of their arms, and the position of their heads. These features present a visual strategy for communicating narrative to the audience. It is how we begin to understand and interpret what we see, even without additional context, like a backstory. Before The Adventures of Tom Sawyer was published, Williams illustrated another of Twain's books called Sketches, New and Old, which presented what scholar Beverly David noted as remarkable similarities, despite the former having problems that the American Publishing Company failed to recognize or learn from. Within Twain's book of sketches, it is a short episode entitled A Curious Dream, wherein the protagonist dreams himself conversing with the dead in a woefully mismanaged graveyard. At the conclusion of this story, the protagonist describes, I awoke and found myself lying with my head out of the bed, sagging downwards considerably, a position favorable to dreaming dreams with morals in them, maybe, but not poetry. What may now arise as familiar to you is the illustrated pose that recognizably borrows from Wallace and Fuseli. More than simply using the pose as a design reference, Williams' use forms an echoed ekphrastic connection to Twain's description and situates both within a larger cultural narrative of the alluded to paintings. While there is much more to be said about the cultural narrative at play, what is crucial to this paper's argument is how the connection sheds light on the complex and nuanced visual vocabulary developing across sketches in Tom Sawyer. Williams' illustration in sketches directly lends itself to a visual definition of the shared pose by way of Twain's description of it as a position favorable to dreaming dreams with morals in them, maybe, but not poetry. The combination of text and image effectively renders the pose representative of something specific, an external reflection of something internal, a moral dream or affect that cannot be consciously contained. Now, when viewing the illustration Tom Dreams in the Haunted Room in The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, we begin to see not merely a visual repetition for the sake of representing the story taking place in the text, but an intentional and strategic use of particular pose to expand and connect the characters to their story and their story to a broader cultural narrative through how they visually embody them. In her essay on adaptation, centered primarily on film, Barbara Strawman posits that transmediality refers to the practice of telling a story in several media. Strawman's generalized definition provides a helpful entryway into the topic, but as she goes on to explain, within the fields of literary and media studies, as well as within the theories and practices concerned with narratology across media, transmediality is not so terminologically straightforward. Jan Nolfland's definition of transmediality and transmedial narratology in contemporary media culture addresses one of the inherent contradictions, that it is a quality pertaining to both the specificity and universality of media strategies. Thawn synthesizes his work with that of Werner Wolf and Iran Rajewski in order to describe the term transmediality as referring to a quality of cultural signification that tends to privilege representational strategies rather than what these strategies represent, but can, for example, also be observed on the level of ahistorical formal devices that occur in more than one medium, such as motific repetition, thematic variation, or even narrativity. Within Thawn's definition, transmediality, delineated as a quality of cultural signification, demonstrates the idea that different media signify or represent cultural meaning by using strategies associated with a particular media. More importantly, these strategies, which combine the form and technique of the associated media, are of greater focus than the representational product, i.e. their specific cultural meaning. Yet this also suggests that the strategies for representation are thoroughly intertwined with their conveyed content and cultural meaning, making them contextually variable and reliant on specific understandings of the cultural, social, and historical factors influencing their representations. In contrast, ahistorical formal devices are not context-dependent. They are generalized so as to be equally applicable across different media and cultures. They give shape to meaning, but do not, in and of themselves, convey any specific cultural meaning. Transmediality thus occupies the shadowy realm between the specific and universal applications of media. Rather than choosing to embrace one media form or the other, Thawn holds the specific and universal aspects of transmediality together in a productive connection. His definition maintains that transmediality does indeed address the way a narrative can be told in various media, but he also reveals how transmediality contributes to a narrative simultaneously taking shape within both culturally specific media strategies and the universal strategies that transcend medium and time. Strawman mentions how film adaptations have been described as a digest, or rather a way of processing literature so as to make it more widely accessible in popularized form to a mass audience. She also goes on to explain that while analyzing adaptations, the very fact of media transfer can be seen as enriching. The media changes at stake in adaptation allow us to trace the medial differences and specificities, as well as to recognize and describe the added value of such transfer. Similar to film, the adaptation of literature into any popularized form can be thought of as a means of increasing accessibility to the source text most basically in how it refers back to it, concentrating some of its core elements and refining them for marketability and mass consumption. While accessibility in terms of presenting a story in a popular form may highlight the cultural significance of the source text, it does not necessarily make the text itself clearer or easier to understand. That is, adaptation into a popular media form clues people into the specific cultural meaning of a source text, which offers them access to the text in the form of a general impression, but does not necessarily provide them with any deeper knowledge of it. Aside from accessibility, literary adaptation also provides a means for understanding the differences between media and the implied advantage of altering any media forms preceding it, i.e., understanding processes of adaptation in tandem with what is being adapted allows us to trace the shifting value of specific media, text, image, film, music, etc., within a broader culture. To best understand the significance of literary adaptation in Moby-Dick and Tom Sawyer, particularly when thinking ahead to how illustration relates to the text in a cultural consciousness, it is crucial to have an understanding of the interconnected concept of remediation. Borrowing from Strawman once more, remediation describes how media adapt other media and absorb them into their media logic. In terms of literary adaptation, remediation reflects how the source text transforms across media and how this process binds them in constant dialogic relation to each other, and while they vie for a sense of primacy in the mind of the interpreter. A good example of this can be seen in how we experience the narratives of Moby-Dick and Tom Sawyer respectively in a text-only format versus how we might experience them in their illustrated editions. Each artistic intervention offers the audience a version of the narrative limited to the creative possibility of its own media type and the modes of sensory experience that media engages. Strawman's definition of remediation draws from the work of J. David Bolter and Richard Grusin in their book Remediation, Understanding New Media, in which they also explain how each act of mediation depends on other acts of mediation. Media are continually commenting on, reproducing, and replacing each other, and this process is integral to media. Media need each other in order to function as media at all. In distinction from media, a medium can be thought of as that which facilitates media transfer, or as Bolter and Grusin describe, a medium is that which remediates. Are you sick of media yet? It is that which appropriates the techniques, forms, and social significance of other media and attempts to rival or refashion them in the name of the real. In essence, media constitute the end products that convey content, film, books, paintings, musical performances, etc. They are the tangible or experienced outputs that audiences engage with. Mediums are the tools, processes, and materials used to create media, things like paint, cameras, production teams, and language. Mediums serve as vehicles through which ideas are transmitted into consumable formats. Remediation thus serves as an umbrella concept to describe the relationship between media forms, how they interact, influence, and transform one another. Within the concept of remediation, we can begin to tease out some of the complexity of intermedial exchange and how the interdependence of media clashes with its tendency to overwrite other media. In combining Strawman's points with Bolter and Grusin's, we see literary adaptation through a process of remediation points to a recursive and symbiotic dynamic between the source text and the various media forms adapted from it, wherein the perceived value of one is simultaneously determined and increased or decreased in terms of its relation to the other. While each representation of either Moby-Dick or Tom Sawyer in another media form may engage audiences without them having necessarily read the novel, their remediated existence still depends on the original text, and they risk losing some of their own narrative strength in the interpretive space between them and the novel, or even each other. By so doing, these adaptations and artistic interventions sustain their source text and their relevance, allowing people to access some aspects of their narratives and time-specific cultural meanings through the media forms they may be more inclined to engage with. At the same time, they obscure the original narrative as it is supplied by the text and how they condense, add, and or evolve both individual and cultural perspectives of the text-conveyed content. In other words, the source media and its metaphorical offspring generate a sense of value and meaning for themselves and the narrative as a whole in the way they feed on one another. When considering the principally unfavorable reception of Moby-Dick after its original publication, it is difficult to fathom its trajectory, the trajectory of its resurgence and its eventual transformation into the novel that has been the most, quote, the most continuously, frequently, and diversely depicted of American literary works, end quote. Yet in a review by one of Melville's early critics, we can begin to see an aversion to one aspect of the novel that ironically prefigures a point of enduring cultural fascination and the source of its adaptability. In November of 1851, Parker's Journal printed an anonymous review which describes Moby-Dick as a medium of information cannot be found at fault with. As a work of fiction, it is liable for the objection which presents itself to all of Melville's writings since Typee. The reviewer goes on to suggest that the objection is how Melville, quote, runs into the grave error of giving us altogether too much for our money. He spreads his subject out beyond all reasonable bounds until the scene becomes altogether too long for the motive, and the finest writing will not prevent it from becoming tiresome. In a somewhat humorous way, the 19th century reviewer echoes Ishmael's own sentiments that, about why whales were not typically consumed, because when you come to sit before a meat pie nearly 100 feet long, it takes away your appetite. Both express the idea that confronting too much of a thing tends to be daunting. While the notion of the text's expansiveness was overly exhaustive of its subject, may have been a key threat to its early critical reception, generations of readers since have found this feature as an inexhaustible wellspring of creative inspiration. Approximately 25 years after Melville's early critics struggled and failed to stomach Moby-Dick, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer would flop onto the market and also fall grossly short of more than a few expectations. According to scholar Susan Gannon, Tom Sawyer stood to be one of Twain's more ambitious illustrated projects because, quote, the novel would be a bid for fame and status, meant to establish Twain's place in the literary world and to appeal to a more demanding audience as a crossover item, aimed at the dual audience of children and adults. The illustrations would have to be suitable for the young, yet satisfying enough for their elders. Although, end quote. Although Twain seemed to put great stock in what Tom Sawyer might do for his career, Beverly David notes in her book, Twain and His Illustrators, as a result of the bad timing, the bad promotion, the lukewarm reviews, and the not very imaginative illustrating, early American sales of Tom Sawyer were disappointing. In fact, by the end of 1879, profits from the adventures of Tom Sawyer and sketches, new and old combined, brought Clemens only $15,000. Among the many pitfalls of Tom Sawyer's publication process and release, David specifically includes Williams's not very imaginative illustrating. as a reason for its poor reception relative to Twain's other illustrated works, not least of all Tom Sawyer's much better received sequel, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. David decries far more than Williams's lack of imagination in the illustrations, however, and provides a sharp aesthetic critique. End quote. Williams was largely responsible, despite the flattering things Clemens said of him, for the inferior artistic quality of the designs in Tom Sawyer. The craftsmanship in the book was at its lowest level for the American Publishing Company editions. Williams' sketches has lost all the crispness and intensity so evident in his work on other Mark Twain books. An excessive use of cross-hatching gave to his new style a somberness that was aggravated by engravers' coarse lines and a heavy inking of the plates. Scenes were dark, dull, and uninteresting. Gone was the edge of good graphic design. The pictures of Tom, Huck, Aunt Polly, Jim, and the rest were, for the most part, cardboard duplicates of the portraits and sketches new and old. Beyond being shallow, they were also often inconsistent in characterization, end quote. Among aesthetic choices that led to technical printing issues and the reuse of character designs, David's unsparing assessment also underscores a pervasive fault with Williams's work that even Gannon, who by and large offers a more commendatory view of the late illustrator's efforts, can't seem to overlook: the matter of visual consistency, or lack thereof. While generations of readers have found much to connect with and draw from in The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, evidenced at the very least, like Moby-Dick, by its persistent presence in American literary and pop culture, True Williams's illustrations don't appear to inspire the same fondness for the classic, even in a visual sense, as Twain's text alone. Gannon, as well as David years previous, falls in line with the host of critics who have, quote, justly complained that Williams' depictions of Tom and the other characters are inconsistent, end quote. Although, unlike David, Gannon attempts to understand and outline the shared vision that left Twain so pleased with the illustration as to write to William Dean Howells, quote, Williams has made about 200 rattling pictures for Tom Sawyer, some of them very dainty. Poor devil, what a genius he has. He takes a book of mine and without suggestion from anybody builds no end of pictures just from his reading of it, end quote. In light of Twain's review, Gannon's analysis proves much more sympathetic to the difficult task of illustrating Tom Sawyer, outlining how the novel's episodic, rambling nature would be problematic, its chameleon protagonist impossible to pin down, and a convincingly consistent image. Despite this, and borrowing a term from W.J.T. Mitchell, Gannon describes Williams and Twain as having together managed to create an intriguing image text, a composite synthetic work combining Twain's masterful narrative, his ingenious typographical variations, playful page headings, and documentary pastiche, with Williams' sympathetic, conceptually interesting illustrations and decorative format. Gannon's essay calls attention to the inherent complexity and nuance of Tom Sawyer's illustrations, and with insights gleaned from the image text, she moves the surrounding discourse beyond David's conclusion that they were of an inferior artistic quality. Even still, Gannon's more restorative and expansive argument for Williams's illustrations does not manage to see the inconsistency of their character design as much more than that, an inconsistency. The inconsistent character design that has long been viewed by critics as a troublesome aesthetic foible on Williams's part might actually be more indicative of the author's and illustrator's shared vision of Tom Sawyer, a text that one might build no end of pictures from reading, that exhibits something of a composite order of architecture. Before offering a closer analysis of Williams's illustrations, however, it is first helpful to return to the lineage of adaptations that emerged from Moby-Dick to see an analogous relationship taking shape between text and image. For contemporary artist Wu Sang and her collaborators, Moby-Dick's overwhelming verbosity was a central point of consideration when they approached the work of adapting it into a feature-length film that would then go on to catalyze both an immersive installation and virtual reality partner projects. In her flash art interview, Sang explained that the group's strategy was to try to be really simple. For example, the vastness of the ocean is something that we couldn't possibly convey, and so in a way, everything was just done very minimally on a soundstage. Sang also expressed the feeling that a lot of aspects of Moby-Dick are too big, and because of this, abstraction became a way to deal with the bigness of everything. Beyond demonstrating a willingness to embrace the immensity that some of Melville's earliest critics rejected, Sang's approach to Moby-Dick reveals a modern refashioning of limitation as a strategy and means of liberation, a move that mirrors a shift in visual narrative strategies that began to take hold in 1930 with Rockwell Kent and the Lakeside Press's illustrated edition of Moby-Dick. After a ruinous critical reception, Melville's resurrected whales swam back into the literary world and began its narrative journey into the realm of the transmedial a few years after Melville's death in 1891. Moby-Dick had been reprinted in a few text-only editions before the close of the 19th century, but its resurfacing was eventually visualized in two illustrated editions, one printed in 1896 with art by A. Burnham Shute and the other by I.W. Tabor in 1899. Elizabeth Schultz, in her comprehensive study of the Moby-Dick's fixed presence in 20th century American art, explains, quote, "These first illustrated editions are in keeping with the conventions of the late 19th century illustrated trade novel, and that despite the captions associating the picture with a particular episode, these tableaux of action scenes are, for the most part, so generalized in conception as to make it possible to relate them to any number of episodes in the novel," end quote. Because these early illustrations were so conventional and largely nonspecific, they seem to do little more than offer readers a means of visualizing the text. Schultz elaborates on this point and reasons, quote, "If no political, psychological, or philosophical subtext is suggested in these generalized early illustrations, their emphasis upon the exotic and upon confrontation anticipates the films, comic books, and illustrations, and many abridged and altered versions that will dominate the visual interpretations of Moby-Dick in the 20th century. Chute and Tabor set the stage for the literary adaptation of Moby-Dick in a relatively straightforward way, providing a baseline of thematic imagery for later artistic interventions. In the time since the publication of Schultz's book, however, the steady growth of scholarship on topics of intermediality in illustration has picked up where her qualifying "if" leaves off, revealing how there may be more subtext to these images than meets the eye. The conventions of early illustration that Schultz describes constrain Moby-Dick's narrative depth, though not necessarily by design, and set a visual precedent that other artists would later navigate and redefine. In his essay, The 19th Century Illustrated Novel, Peter Wagner takes up the question concerning the intermediality of illustration, a concept that can be fundamentally understood as the dialogic relationship between a text and its accompanying illustrations. As Wagner sets out a core premise of his topic, he cautions, quote, "We should be aware of the fact that the visual representation distorts, obscures, and misrepresents the text it allegedly clarifies and explains. This is so because, to begin with, the excess of the image, that which cannot be or is expressed in words, always changes the denotative context and range of the textual meaning. Furthermore, a verbal representation cannot be translated, as it were, into a visual counterpart, without a loss or partial alteration of the meaning." End quote. The translation from one media form into another, in this case the translation of text into image, inherently generates subtext owing to the representational as well as conventional limitations of each distinct form of media. Schultz captures the essence of this representational divide when she notes that early illustrators who were committed to an aesthetic of verisimilitude, to historical accuracy, and strictly realistic representation were themselves limited by Moby-Dick's psychological and philosophical nuances, as well as its complex images and symbols. In essence, even though Melville's prose was often rich with visual imagery, much more of Moby-Dick resists visual interpretation. Confined to those sections of the text that could be rendered in the kind of conventional images demanded at the time, Moby-Dick's early illustrations contributed to the advent of a narrative sundering, the extraction and cultural promotion of Ahab's more readily visible quest from Ishmael's larger philosophical quest that incorporates the former. While people in the early 20th century had the option to experience Ishmael's broader narrative in Moby-Dick via the text, the only narrative they could see grew out of and embodied that quote, tried and true proven reading of many American novels, the boy's adventure story, end quote. In contrast to early illustrators like Tabor and Chute, who were confined, gotta go quick. In contrast to early illustrators like Tabor and Chute, who were confined to specific tradition of illustration at their time and thus constrained Moby-Dick's visual narrativity, Kent's approach to illustration unfettered the medium's narrative possibilities, setting a new standard that brought the novel's broader philosophical themes together with its visual potential. In an essay by Matthew J. Abrams, the depth of Kent's Moby-Dick project comes to light not just in how the artist visually reinterprets the text, but in how he engages with the theory of Melville's own project. Quote, "Kent's illustrations mark a complex intervention that was explicitly designed to critique Melville's own visuality," end quote. Abrams asserts and goes on to note that Kent's, quote, "images were more complex than most commentators gave them credit for," end quote. Abrams also outlines that in the years Kent spent preparing to illustrate the Lakeside Press edition of Moby-Dick, he found and made deliberate use of the images that had inspired Melville's own textually reinterpreted paintings. Quote, "Kent's highly stylized illustrations remediate these chronicles and their attendant imagery through three approaches: by directly copying illustrations that Melville used as sources, by hybridizing Melville's visuality with its actual antecedents, and by preempting the pictures that Ishmael hopes to paint, thus complicating, if not abrogating, the narrator's will to ekphrasis. In other words, Kent's images complete a tripartite verbal-visual signal jamming that could magnify, reverse, collapse, or ironize Melville's own visuality," end quote. Through a layered process of remediation, Kent's illustrations appear as a kind of visual telephone, a transfiguration of text into image that had begun as a transfiguration from image into text. Or as Abrams puts it, Kent creates an image-word-image circuit, which represented not a perfect return to the source image, but a return filtered through multiple registers of medium exchange, as if one had translated Moby-Dick from English into Mandarin and back into English. What Abrams so keenly brings to the fore is how Kent participates and contributes to a breaking of the fourth wall by generating sophisticated networks of reflexivity that then complicate Moby-Dick's narrative and reflect Melville's own interest in the self-reflexive. Kent reached beyond the text's most readily visible narrative to grasp something of its author. By Abrams' estimation and in Ahabian terms, Kent made a move to strike through the mask and expose the designs of the creator through the fallibility of his own creation. In his essay, Abrams concludingly remarks, quote, Kent's illustrations, like good literary criticism, shine a light into the darkness of Melville's aesthetic, which when we come to realize just how accurate Kent was in identifying Melville's visuality, makes his own intervention a truly remarkable critique of the novel and its governing aesthetic. While Abrams presents a sound verdict, he seems to overlook how, by engaging with Melville, as well as Ishmael, in a creator-to-creator dialogue on aesthetic design, Kent's illustrations end up serving more aptly as remediated reflections, both of and on the text, rather than as a critique of it, a key point in the novel's development as a transmedial narrative. All right, I've got a couple things left, and I'm going to fly through it. Yeah, Kent's brought... Okay, yes. Yeah. Actually, I'll just kind of summarize. So where we're kind of going from here, because this is still a work in progress, is that the kind of effect that we see happening in the early illustrations of Moby-Dick from this kind of constrained visual narrative that then expands into a more philosophical narrative once we get Kent. We kind of see a reversal of that with True Williams' illustrations, where he kind of starts this Kent-like project and how he's developing this kind of like verbal imagery and way of thinking about the text that is then constrained by later illustrators who kind of revert back to this idea of the boys' adventure novel. So I will end there. Thank you so much.